The Holocaust happened. That isn't opinion, that's fact. And I won't debate fact. Denial is about Professor Deborah Lipstadt, who is a professor of Holocaust Studies at Emory University. She's written many books. One of them is called Denying the Holocaust, and in this book she devoted a few paragraphs about David Irving, who is a British historian who is a Holocaust denier.
According to the evidence I've seen, there were no gas chambers anywhere at Auschwitz.
As with any ideologue, you speak outrageous things and you find that there are other people who believe those outrageous things.
How much money have you made out of that tattoo since 1945?
Irving's just sent us notice of a suit to be filed in the High Court.
In 1996, he brought a libel suit against me. He was claiming I was defaming him and falsely calling him a Holocaust denier.
He wanted to sue her in London because the weight of defense is much more difficult in London.
Wait, I have to prove what I said was true?
Correct.
Yes, but I'm the innocent party. In the US, there's a presumption of innocence.
Yeah, not in the UK.
Anthony Julius is a solicitor. In the British law system, a solicitor means that you prepare the case. And there's a barrister who argues the case that has been prepared by the solicitor. So Richard Rampton was the barrister.
Richard Rampton was wonderful, and Tom Wilkinson portrays him magnificently.
This case is happening to you, but it's not about you.
He has to convince Deborah that the survivors shouldn't speak.
Our strategy is to keep the focus on Irving and Irving alone.
Whatever the reasons why people become deniers, when you look closely, they often have an agenda which they won't admit to. So it was really essential to meet Deborah, to get a sense of her central gravity in the way she speaks and moves. We spent a couple of days in my kitchen talking, for hours and hours and hours.
I don't think her Brooklyn accent would have endeared her to the court.
My friends will say to me, she captured your accent. I said, you think?
Suddenly it becomes respectable to say the Holocaust didn't happen?
Here is one of the largest killing machines in human history.
We know what it is, it's how we prove what it is. The Holocaust happened, everybody knows it. But once you have to prove that it happened, it's harder than you think.
There are no holes in that roof. Therefore, there never were any gas chambers.
No holes, no Holocaust. He wanted a catchy phrase, he's got it.
Obviously, I'm aware that the character that I play is very controversial, but it's my job to play him from his absolute view and give it texture of a fully rounded character. I'm not a racist.
He's a liar and a falsifier of history. This is not a Holocaust movie. It's about the fight for truth and justice around this trial.
We argue that Irving deliberately subordinated the truth in order to propagate anti-Semitism and engender sympathy for the Third Reich.
You can lie and be held accountable, but you can't say my opinion is equal to fact.
The earth is round, the ice caps are melting, and Elvis is not alive.
You can argue about how it happened, who was responsible, but you can't debate whether it happened.
I didn't bring the prosecution, he did.
Settle.
And what would you want me to settle for? 4 million dead? 3? What number would you be comfortable with?
You can't fight every battle, because otherwise you go through life fighting.
The reason you don't engage with people you disagree with is because you can't.
But there's certain battles you can't turn away from.
It's now my pleasure to present Dr. Deborah Lipstadt.
Thank you and good evening. My warmest words of congratulations to the honorees, to the organizers. I've seen many events in many corners of the world, in the United States, in the Jewish community outside, and to paraphrase the book of Proverbs, this surpasses them all. It's really quite amazing. When I was first asked to write a book about Holocaust denial, it wasn't a topic that was of great interest to me. In fact, I thought it was pretty strange that two very prominent historians would ask me to do that, would recommend strongly that I write this book. To me, Holocaust denial was akin to flat earth theory. Who would believe such ridiculousness? The Holocaust has the dubious distinction of being the best documented genocide in history. And To deny it seemed just silly, and to believe in denial seemed even sillier. But then these historians, these very prominent historians, again urged me to look at it. And I began to look at it. I began to study it. And I began to try to figure out their modus operandi. How do deniers present these arguments? What are these arguments? And as you saw in the featurette that was just shown, I wrote a book about it, and I devoted at most a couple of pages to David Irving, who was a British historical writer, a writer of books on history, many of them on World War II history. But the books always had an interesting right-wing slant. And by that I don't mean conservative or, as we would talk, right and left in politics, but far-right, extremist. By example, they always seemed to try to find areas where the Allies were wrong and the Nazis were right, where the Allies practiced atrocities and the German people were the victims. And any time he wrote about the Jews, it was written in a very sneering, critical way, in which made you think, well, what happened to the Jews was bad, but on some level they deserved what they got. Then in the late 1980s, in the period before that, he began to keep company with deniers, but never exactly openly denied the Holocaust until the late 1980s, when there was a trial, the Zundel trial in Toronto, some of you may remember it, of the Holocaust denier, and he testified there that he believed there were no gas chambers, there were no mass killings, and he also said things like Hitler was the best friend the Jews had in Germany. So at that point, I was in the midst of writing my book, and I included him in the book, and I described him in pretty harsh terms, that's for sure, as the most dangerous of Holocaust deniers. He was the most dangerous because, unlike other deniers, such as David Duke or Robert Faurisson or others, who were known only for being deniers, David Duke was also known for being head of the Ku Klux Klan, David Irving was known as this writer of historical works. So his books would get reviewed in leading journals and leading publications. And reviewers would generally say, oh, his comments about the Holocaust, that's just ridiculous. That's not even worth considering. But let's take other things he said seriously and look at them. And my response was, as they began to run into those reviews, was that the normal thing would have been to say, anybody who can make such a ridiculous argument about the Holocaust, I'm not going to take anything he says seriously. But that's not what happened. So I included in my book, I called him the most dangerous of deniers, and also someone who knows the truth and bends it to meet his pre-existing conclusions and his pre-existing ideological views. He knew what really happened, but he took those documents and he twisted them. Unlike other deniers, again, he was not one who was convinced. He did the convincing. He was not one who read things about it and was convinced by them. He wrote those things or prepared those arguments or gave those arguments to other deniers. The book was published in the United States to a very, very positive reception, immediately bought by Penguin UK and published in London. Shortly after its publication, he brought suit against me, and as some of you know, I know some of you have seen the movie, the British libel system is the diametric opposite of the American libel system. In America, if I say you libeled me, I have to prove that you libeled me. In Britain, if I say you libeled me, you, as the author of the words, have to prove the truth of what you said. Now, that's more than just an interesting quirk, because that determined what I could do. Many people have said I was so brave, I wouldn't settle, etc. But it meant that if I didn't fight this, he would win by default. And had he won by default, he could then say, my, David Irving, version of the Holocaust, which meant no mass extermination of the Jews, no planned program of the Jews, no gas chambers, all made up by Jews in order to get money and estate, is a true version, because I would have been found guilty of libeling him. I couldn't let that happen. I couldn't let that happen because of history in general, as Alan said in his generous introduction. But I also couldn't let it happen because I couldn't think of myself ever looking a child of survivors or a survivor in the eye and knowing that I had let this stand because, oh, nobody would believe him. But there was another reason as well. And that is because it became clear to me, the more I looked at Holocaust denial, that Holocaust denial is a classic form of anti-Semitism. Holocaust deniers argue that the Jews made this all up, as I said earlier, in order to get a state, in order to get reparations, which is a fancy word, of course, for money. So if you think about the elements of anti-Semitism, every prejudice has certain stereotypical elements. The standard stereotypical elements of anti-Semitism are, of course, Jews manipulating, secretly manipulating, even though they're small in number, using their intelligence, using their conniving intelligence to get what they want and to harm the majority. And, of course, to do it for the sake of financial gain. This, by the way, and I really need more time to develop this, I'll just throw it out there. The roots of these charges are, of course, to be found in the way in which some Christian leaders and church fathers over the millennia have taught the deicide story, the story of the death of Jesus in the New Testament. Irrespective of the fact that everybody in the story is Jewish, except the Romans who actually crucified Jesus, they teach it as a small group of Jews harmed this innocent individual because he wanted to, this innocent and holy individual, because he wanted to chase the money changers out of the temple. From that story comes the stereotypical elements of anti-Semitism, which prevail today, and by the way, prevail in many respects in certain things we're seeing in contemporary anti-Semitism and contemporary anti-Israel attitudes. In any case, to go back to the lawsuit, I knew I had to fight him, and one of the first things I did was it was suggested to me that I get my own lawyer, that I shouldn't just depend on the Penguin's lawyers, because Penguin's lawyers essentially were working for the Penguin's insurance company, and if they pulled the plug, I would be left high and dry. It was suggested to me that I contact a lawyer in England, a man named Anthony Julius. You saw him pictured in the movie by Andrew Scott, and the little featurette by Andrew Scott. And so a friend called me and said, there is someone, a British friend who knew about the case, there is someone in England I think would be very good to represent you. He's very smart, he's very clever, he's very assertive on behalf of his clients. Maybe if he was a woman he would have said aggressive, but man, it was assertive. And I think, I know that 51% of the audience just appreciated that. And he does not abide anti-Semites. He will go after them in the most direct fashion. I said, what's his name? And my friend said his name is Anthony Julius. And it rang a bell. And I said, oh, wait a minute. I know his name. Didn't he just write a book on T.S. Eliot and anti-Semitism and literary criticism? Because the book had been written, had been published, and all the reviews said, this is a book by a lawyer in England who, while working full-time as a lawyer specializing in libel and freedom of the press, and press issues, had gone back to graduate school and gotten a PhD in comparative literature. And when Anthony was profiled in the New Yorker and asked about the fact that as a lawyer, working full-time as a lawyer, he got a PhD, he said, look, some lawyers play golf on Wednesday. I went to graduate school. What's the big deal? So that makes an impression on you when you're in the academic world. So once I said that to my friend began to laugh. Clearly something I had said he had found very, very amusing. When he stopped laughing, I remembered something else about Anthony, and I added that, and I said, isn't he also Princess Diana's divorce lawyer? And my friend said, Deborah, that's why I'm laughing. You're the only one in the world who would say author of a book on T.S. Eliot and also Princess Diana's divorce. more importantly, once Anthony came on board, a number of things happened. First of all, the case became much higher profile. He was very well known in England and in other places. But more importantly, Anthony began to devise our forensic strategy. And a forensic strategy, again, as some of you have seen Denial know this, our forensic strategy was, first of all, yes, I was the one on trial together with Penguin, my publisher, but we were going to flip it, and we were going to, by following David Irving's footnotes back to the sources, we were going to prove that what he said was based on lies. That when he said, I have a document which proves XYZ, we would find that document, we would look at that document, and we would certainly find that, and we did every time we looked, that the document didn't say XYZ, it said ABC. It was he completely misconstrued what was there. In other words, those who believe that deniers are convinced to say what they say because they got some misinformation, whether it was the way the Soviets portrayed the Holocaust or the way Poles portrayed the Holocaust or whatever it might be. That's not what's happening. What's happening is deniers take this information and twist it. I'll give you an example in relation to Kristallnacht. David Irving, who's a great fan of Adolf Hitler and defends him tremendously and very vigorously, says that on the night of Kristallnacht, when Hitler heard what was happening, he ordered that a telegraph be sent out to all the areas in Germany to stop the madness, stop the attacks on Jews that were taking place November 1938. Well, when you look at the exact telex, I think it went out at 1:56 in the morning, it says arson against Jewish shops and the like is to be halted. So what David Irving takes is he takes the word and the like, and he says arson and the like. So Irving argues, he said everything should be stopped against Jewish, and he changes shops to institutions against Jewish institutions. But it didn't say that. The reason that Hitler wanted the arson stopped is that whole blocks, synagogues were being burnt, but fire doesn't stop when it reaches the edge of the synagogue. It keeps going. So fire departments from around, heads of city from around Germany were saying whole blocks are going up in smoke because arson is being engaged in against Jewish shops, Jewish institutions, etc., and it was the arson he wants stopped. But if you read David Irving's work, he says Hitler tried to stop it. I'll give you another example. I know there are some Hungarian survivors here. In April 1943, mid-April, April 15th and 16th, Adolf Hitler and Foreign Minister Ribbentrop had a meeting with Admiral Horthy. Admiral Horthy was the head of the Hungarian government. And the Hungarians had been persecuting the Jews, but they were allies of the Germans, but they had not agreed to allow for the deportation of the Jewish community. They had treated them horribly and sent them to camps, but again, they were not allowing them to be deported. So it was a 2-day meeting, and we have the transcript of the meeting. Notes were taken. And on the first day, Horthy says to Hitler, what do you expect me to do to deport the Jews, that they should die like beasts in the field? And Hitler says, no, that's not necessary. On the second day, when Horthy asked the same question again, first of all, Ribbentrop says the Jews should be taken to camps, should be killed or taken to camps and allowed to die, which is a pretty strong statement. And then Hitler launches into a harangue. Blood is dripping from every word. The Jews are like tuberculous bacilli. If they are not destroyed, they will destroy others. They must be taken away. They must be destroyed. It's a prescription for murder. How does David Irving deal with that? He takes the 2 days and he switches the sequence. So he has Hitler's harangue on the first day, and on the second day, says when Horthy asked again, Hitler said, no, that's not necessary. Well, that's not the sequence in which it happened. He takes Ribbentrop's statement and he buries it in a footnote, even though it's a very clear acknowledgement of Ribbentrop saying the Jews are being murdered. And then finally, in his author's voice, he says, and to try to explain to the reader why Hitler and Ribbentrop were so anxious to have the Jews deported, he says, this, of course, was the time of the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, when the 30,000 Jews in the ghetto at Warsaw were rising up against the Nazis with arms supplied to them by troops retreating from the east. Now, the only troops retreating from the east at that point, there weren't even that many, were Germans, and I can assure you they were not supplying arms to the Jews in the Warsaw Ghetto. And there weren't 30,000 Jews rising up against the Nazis. There were probably 1,000 Jews involved in the revolt. But more importantly, this meeting with Horthy took place on April 15th and 16th. The Warsaw Ghetto uprising started 3 days later. And it was not as if Hitler knew, oh, we're having the Warsaw Ghetto uprising in 3 days. So the Warsaw Ghetto uprising had no impact on Hitler's decision. But Irving, by very cleverly bringing the two together, and I must say, when I first read it, I said, yes, mid-April, it's the time of the Ghetto uprising, until I looked closely at the dates, gives a rationale, makes it sound like it makes sense to want to get the Jews out of Budapest and to destroy this last remaining Jewish community. And we went through cite after citation after citation after citation, and it wasn't a mistake, or it wasn't that they were using mistaken information. It was that he was taking the information and purposely twisting it. Let me add one other thing about Irving's work or his presentation, and that is, and his arguments, he's not just an anti-Semite. And it's very important to recognize this. He's also a racist of the first order, and he will often, and as are many other Holocaust deniers, many white supremacists, Ku Klux Klanners, alt-right people, are also Holocaust deniers and racists. And the connection, of course, if you go to any white supremacist website, you will see that often they will argue, every time we try to argue about the quote-unquote natural superiority of white people, we're told that that's Nazi science, and Nazi science led to the Holocaust. So the racist goes on to say, you see, the myth of the Holocaust is used to keep us from arguing about the natural superiority of white people. David Irving, we got through the discovery process, we got access to many of the tapes and speeches he had given to his followers in different places. And at one point he was in an area in England giving a speech, and he said, I was on vacation and I turned on the BBC and I saw one of them reading our news to us. It's our news, we should be reading it. And his audience guffaws. They are laughing hysterically. Because, of course, he's talking about people of color reading the news. Then he goes on to say, this is what I would accept, that the important news should be read by dinner-jacketed gentlemen. The unimportant news should be read by women. He's also a misogynist, and racism and anti-Semitism, it's not funny, racism, anti-Semitism, misogyny are a package deal. They go together. And he says the unimportant news should be read by women. And then he said, and the news of criminals and drug busts should be read by Trevor McDonald. Sir Trevor McDonald, was a very prominent newscaster in England at the time, a man of Caribbean descent, a black man. So white men reading the important news, women reading the unimportant news, and a black man reading news of criminals and drug busts. And he did those kind of things all the time. In fact, when we presented this in court, Irving turned to the judge and he said, Your Lordship, Mr. Rampton, my barrister, is trying to present me as a racist. I'm not a racist. I was talking about women. So, that made it okay. Let me, before I conclude, let me bring in one other element here. And you so touchingly, the rabbi so touchingly had all the survivors stand. And we wish you, as we say, ad 120 bis 120, until 120 years. But the tyranny of the clock cannot be stopped. And we know that we lose so many survivors every year. When I first started teaching, every year when I teach my history of the Holocaust class, I bring in a survivor to speak, because the power of the person who can speak in the first person singular cannot be matched by the most erudite and brilliant professor or teacher or lecturer. And when I first started, I would have my choice. Do I want someone who had been in a camp? Do I want someone who was in hiding, someone who was in the resistance? Now I'm happy if I can find someone who feels strong enough and healthy enough and willing to come and speak. But we didn't bring survivors as witnesses. And that was very hard for me. We didn't bring them because we wanted the focus to be on David Irving, A, and B, David Irving was representing himself, and we didn't want to expose survivors to be cross-examined by David Irving. We believed strongly that his objective would be to humiliate them, to embarrass them, to confuse them, and that's easy to do when you're talking about such a traumatic moment. You arrived in Auschwitz in the daytime, you arrived at night, you turned to the left, you turned to the right. You could confuse people about the details of what happened and make them look like they really don't know what they're talking about. But it was very hard, because survivors did come up to me and asked to be able to testify and pressured me on this. And I knew that ultimately my lawyers had decided on the right forensic strategy, and this was a forensic issue and not an emotional issue. We had to stick to what would win the case, and we won. Spoiler alert, for those of you who haven't seen the film, we won. But it was difficult. And I remember one day walking into the courtroom, and a cousin of mine had come from Israel. People came all the time to be with me, and a cousin stopped me, and she said, Deborah, there's a woman here, a survivor, who wants to speak to you. And I said, Brenda, I would love to speak to her, but I can't take care of anyone. I don't have emotional energy. She said, no, she has something to show you. So this cousin, having come all the way from Israel to London to be with me, I felt I owed it to her. She took me over to the woman. The woman stood up and gave me a piece of paper. And on the paper were about a dozen names, and each name, Sarah Horowitz, Yaakov Horowitz, Rivka Horowitz Frankel. In other words, the Horowitz family. I'm just using that as an example. Next to each name was a precise date of birth, and then an approximate date of death, and sometimes just a question mark. It was her family, and she was showing me the list. When someone gives you a list like that, you don't just peruse it, look it over quickly, but you read each name. What do you say? To say anything is just paltry, would sound paltry. So I tried with my body language to give it back to her, show I know your pain, I feel your pain, I understand what this is doing for you. And she got angry, and she said to me, no, you must have this. You must have this. This is my evidence. And that day in the courtroom, and for many days thereafter, every time I sat down at my table, I would open up that piece of paper and just have it in front of me, so that I was continuing. I didn't need the reminder, but it was a very vivid reminder that there were very real people behind this. Once we won, I was showered with thanks from many quarters, many people, and it was a little embarrassing because I didn't feel myself to be a hero. I had fought a hard fight, but I know many other of my colleagues, had they been in the same situation, would have fought that fight. I was just the one. As he told the New York Times, they asked why he came after me. He said, "I pulled her out of the line to be shot." But the thing that left me most uncomfortable, and still to this day leaves me uncomfortable, happened earlier this evening. When survivors come up to me, and even now children of survivors come up to me to thank me. Now, we all like to be thanked when we work hard at something, and certainly this was hard. It took 6-7 years of my life, and it overwhelmed much of my life. But I'm left feeling very uncomfortable. And I remember I was invited to Israel by then Prime Minister Barak right after the trial. I took my mother. She was very happy, and if somebody didn't know who I was, she told them. One of my great sadnesses is she loved the movies. She would have been thrilled with this. But in any case, I would be stopped on the street by survivors and thanking me. And once I was with my cousin, another cousin, and I said to him, "Please don't thank me." And she said, "Deborah, they must thank you. They feel it in their heart. You can't stop them." So I realized that. But then I began to reflect on why I was so uncomfortable by their thanks. And with this, I want to close. I thought back to the fact that we in Jewish tradition have a concept of acts of loving kindness, gemilut chasadim. And each act of loving kindness, visiting the sick, welcoming the stranger, taking care of the orphan, it is called by its name, bikur cholim, visiting the sick, hachnasat orchim, welcoming the stranger. You know what the act is from the name. There is, however, one act of loving kindness which is not described by its name. It's when we take care of the dead. We call it chesed shel emet, the most genuine, authentic act of chesed, of righteousness, that a human being can perform. Why is it that? Because when we take care of the sick or welcome the stranger, someday we may be sick and that person may take care of us. We don't do it thinking of that, but that's what it means to live in community. You reach out to help others. You welcome a stranger. You invite a college student for Seder, hoping that when your kids are college students and maybe can't come home for Passover, someone else will do that for them. But when it comes to taking care of the dead, there's no way they can repay that favor. And our tradition teaches us that it's at that moment, it's at that precise moment that we as human beings become closest to emulating God. Why? Because there's no way we can pay back God for the gift of life, for the gift of strength, for the successes we've had, for the families we've developed, for our professional successes, for being on this earth and waking each morning and being able to breathe the air and go on with our lives and do what we want to do. There's no way we can thank God. So when we take care of the dead, we perform chesed shel emet, we emulate God. And I realized that I felt, and that was why it was so uncomfortable for me when they thanked me, that I had been given the privilege to take care of the dead in the course of this action. Not just the dead, but those who survived but didn't have the means to stand up against deniers who would destroy their history, destroy what happened to their family, ridicule them, and engage in anti-Semitism. So many of us in this room would love the opportunity to stand up and defeat the anti-Semite, yet we don't get the chance. I got the chance. And it was hard, it was arduous, I didn't seek it out, but I have to say, on some level, I feel very blessed to have had that opportunity. Blessed to have been able to stand up for my people, blessed to be able to stand up for the victims of the Nazis, blessed to be able to stand up on the part for the survivors of the Nazis. It was hard, it was arduous, but on some level, many levels, long before this film was ever even anybody's idea, I feel very lucky. And as the psalmist says, my cup runneth over. Thank you very much.